Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about writing effective resumes and some tips that you can use when starting or refining your resume. So, some objectives for this presentation. We're going to go through the content, organization, and design of resumes. We are going to have one spot where you all can pause and kind of workshop on your own to get a start or kind of to help even better your resume. But for the most part, we're just going to kind of go through some general tips when working on a resume. So, to start out, what is a resume? It is a professional document, as you all probably know, usually around 1 or 2 pages, and it's tailored to specific jobs and specific companies or employers. And its real purpose is to persuade an employer to invite you to an interview. So, a resume is where you can kind of give some background as to who you are and what experiences you have, but then the main goal of the resume is to make sure that an employer wants to get to know you more and they see that you have all the required qualifications. And so, kind of the ultimate goal is to convince the employer to invite you to an interview. So, for the major content sections of resumes, as you can see here, we start out with some sort of letterhead. So, your name should be big, bolded, it should be the biggest and kind of the most eye drawing part of your resume. You can also include kind of your address or your email address and phone number under that little letterhead as well if you want, and we'll kind of go through some specific content that you can add to each of these sections in the next few slides. The next section is your education. So, as you can see, this person has both their Iowa State University experience as well as their study abroad experience. And then going into specific experience sections. So, whether that be work experience or leadership experience, as you can see, those are both outlined in this resume. But there are a lot of other options for experience as well that we'll talk about in the next slide. And then, as you can see, this person also has kind of other things that they add to their resume. So they have these scholarships, honors, and awards, as well as a skills section. And those are also options for you if you're working on your resume and want to include those sections. And we'll talk about some other things that can be included in that other section as well. So, for the content possibilities, as we said, education is usually right under your letterhead. And so in education, you can include your major and minor. I would say that's the number one thing, as well as the school that you go to. So if you go to Iowa State, putting Iowa State University, saying the date that you're expected to graduate, and then including what type of degree you have. So if it's a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science, or if you're a grad student, what type of degree that is, and then what your major is. Any minors and certificates should go in education, as well as any study abroad experience. And then some additional things that you could add to your resume if you are wanting to like expand that section, or if maybe you want to like show that you have specific knowledge in specific areas that the job is looking for. You could put specific courses or class projects that you've worked on that are specifically tied to the job that you're looking at. And you can also include your scholarships and awards in your education section if that's of interest to you. Or, like the previous example that we looked at, you could include that in kind of a separate section at the bottom of your resume as well. Then, going on to your experience section or sections, a lot of people do have two separate experience sections, one for work and one for leadership, or maybe one for relevant experience and one for additional experience. Whatever you decide to, or however you decide to break up your resume in these experience sections, is completely up to you. But some examples would be work experience, research experience, teaching experience, volunteering experience, and internship experience. And then, as we said, other is really where you can kind of completely play around. So you could include any extracurricular involvement, whether you are like on an athletic team or if you're in a club, any extracurricular projects that you've worked on. Even if you have any class projects that you want to highlight that you don't want to put in your education section, those can definitely go in the bottom and kind of like an other section. Any hobbies, service, leadership, if you don't have a specific leadership section, you could put that at the bottom. Any languages that you speak. And then if you don't want to include scholarships and awards in your education section, you could kind of bring awards and honors into a separate section at the end. And then a lot of people also have separate skills section where they just outline specifically what skills they possess. So now this is kind of like a more zoomed in version where we can look specifically at kind of the way that this content is organized. As we talked about, having some sort of contact information at the top. Um, you definitely don't have to include your mailing address if you don't want to. I usually recommend definitely including a phone number and an email address, since likely if an employer is looking at your resume, they'll contact you either by phone or email. And then for like your experience sections and even like your education section, we recommend putting the organization. So for your education, that would be the school, so Iowa State University. Or for a work experience, that would be the company that you work for instance, the Writing and Media Center. And then right underneath the organization, we recommend putting your specific position title. So, for instance, if you worked at the Writing and Media Center and were a communication consultant, your title is communication consultant, and that would go right underneath the organization. We also recommend including the location. So whether that's a school, like for in this example, we have Iowa State University. I oftentimes see just like Ames, Iowa as well, which is totally fine to put. If it's an experience from out of state or even out of the country, putting the city, state, country, if relevant, in this area is also a very good idea. And then as you can see in this example, the dates are all lined up on the right-hand side. And I personally like that organization because I think that it's very clear to read. But if your resume isn't formatted like that, that's fine. We just recommend having the dates that you were in this position somewhere that it's very easy to read on your resume. And then, kind of what I would argue is the most important part of your resume would be the details. So, those are the bullet points that you put under each of these experiences. And those are really what show what you actually did in these experiences and what you will bring with you into the position that you're applying for. So, just a reminder, there is no ideal resume. Um, it The way that your resume looks completely depends on kind of your field, the specific job that you're applying for, what you really want to highlight. If you want more of a creative resume, that's totally fine. Or if you want more of the straightforward resumes, that's also completely fine. So just know that there is no ideal resume. It completely depends on you and what you want to reflect about yourself, as well as the job that you're applying for and what they want you to include on your resume. Also, keep in mind that your resume will change over time. It is a living document, so it might change like once a year. It also might change once an hour. For instance, if you're currently in the job search or internship search, you'll likely submit a resume for every single different position that you're applying for. And that resume hopefully will be different for every single application that you do because you'll want to make sure that you're tailoring what you've done to specifically match the job description. So, I usually recommend just saving every copy of your resume that you have. You might have like 100 different copies of your resume, but sometimes it's nice to look back on old resumes and see what you've maybe taken out that you could add back in, or vice versa, what you could maybe delete forever that you just don't need anymore. So, we're going to go into kind of how you can word your resume. And specifically, this is for the different bullet points in the details that you will include under each experience that you list on your resume. So we recommend using action verbs, quantifying your results, and adding more detail to sound more impressive. We're going to start with these three. So action verbs are really anything that show like what action you took within this position. So for instance, if you supervised people, you could start your bullet point with supervise 200 staff members. And that kind of leads into the quantifying your results. So, really providing as much detail as you can and providing those numbers. So, like, how many staff did you work with? How often did you do these things? Um, those kind of really are what make a bullet point most impressive and what make employers want to continue to read your resume and make employers want to invite you to an interview. We also recommend listing more results and kind of those more detail-oriented bullet points rather than simply stating your responsibilities, and we'll go into some examples of those at the bottom of this slide. So, we have an example of a responsibility, which would just be trained new employees. But a way to make that kind of more detail-oriented would be saying facilitated training activities for 2 new employees for 4 semesters. So that's providing a lot more context and it's giving the potential employer a lot more information as to what you actually did in this position. Another example of this would be a responsibility being tutored at the Writing and Media Center, and then the results for that, instead, like a more detail oriented bullet point, could be consulted with 300 students per semester on written, oral, visual, and electronic communication projects. So, we're going to go into what are action verbs. You just saw kind of a couple examples of how you could start with verbs. For instance, we have facilitated here and we have consulted here. But we have a big list of action verbs here. If you want to just pause and maybe take a screenshot of this, or even just write some of these down so that you can refer to them as you begin working on your resume, that is totally fine. And then we're going to pause again and kind of, you all can take maybe a few minutes to brainstorm a few action verbs and bullet points that effectively highlight your experiences in kind of one of the areas that you really want to emphasize in your resume. So go ahead and pause, and then we'll come back in a few minutes and go over the rest of what to include in your resume. All right, so now that you're back and have hopefully brainstormed some action verbs and bullet points for your resume, we're going to go into how you can kind of look at a job description and tie in what the job description is talking about to your specific resume. So, this is a service representative job description. And if you read through this, you can kind of highlight specific skills that they're wanting you to have to be an effective candidate for this position. So, problem solving, we see the word resolution. We can tie that to the skill of problem solving, and that would be something that you want to emphasize in your resume. In addition, client support or customer support is another thing that the person applying for this position should possess, as well as communication skills, training experience, and mechanical expertise. So, these are all things that you would want to kind of highlight within the job description before even starting and looking at your resume so that you can make sure that you're really pulling in experiences that you have that show that you have these skills. How to organize the content of your resume. There are a few different ways that you could do this. We usually recommend doing it time oriented, specifically reverse chronological. So that would be when you start, like the top experience is your most recent experience, or maybe the experience that you're currently holding. And then below that is your second most recent experience by start date, etc., etc. And then going in that reverse chronological order is usually what we recommend. You could also do it skill based. So, for instance, if you have one experience that's super, super, super relevant to the job that you're applying for, but it's not your most recent experience, you could still put that at the top so it's the first thing that they're reading. Usually, that can be effective if you even make like two separate sections, maybe one titled relevant experience so that you can specifically put that experience at the top of that section, and then going into additional work experience for another section, and then doing the reverse chronological from there. So that's completely up to you, and you can tailor your organization depending on the position. But the main thing is just to make sure that your resume is clear and easy to read. Um, you will need to consult the job advertisement every single time that you look at your resume and are thinking about different ways to organize it, just because you're going to want to make sure that you're really highlighting what you should be for the specific job that you're applying for. Now, for some general design tips, we recommend having some sort of white space in your resume. It makes it easier to read. That's oftentimes why we recommend doing the dates on the right hand side of your resume, is because it then adds some white space between your experience and the dates that you worked those experience. And then for templates, we get questions about if you should use Microsoft Word templates or maybe like Canva templates. I personally do not recommend that simply because a lot of employers will use an applicant tracking system or like an ATS software. And sometimes those like companies and softwares that read through your resume and aren't a real person, it's just artificial intelligence. If they see that it's a template, they might flag it. And then you might automatically be thrown out of their applicant pool. So, for that reason, I usually recommend straying away from templates, as well as the fact that they can just be really finicky and kind of difficult to work with and make revisions on. And as we have talked about many times, your resume is something that should constantly be changing. So, for that reason as well, I don't really recommend templates. Color ink, that's something that's up to you. I always recommend having some sort of contrast. So, like, you won't want yellow ink on white paper because that's really difficult to read. But if you want like a dark blue or like a red or something that will still pop, I think that's fine. But also just keep in mind that a lot of employers, if they print your resume, will print it in black and white no matter what. So maybe you could do a tester and like if you want to include color on your resume, printing it out and seeing what it looks like printed in black and white just to make sure that that contrast is there since that's likely how an employer will print it out. Color paper, um, this would be more if you're, like, handing your resume in person, like, if you're going to a career fair. I personally don't recommend color paper just because that contrast can kind of be missing with a lot of different colors, but that's ultimately up to you. I usually recommend kind of a simple white paper, doesn't even have to be resume paper, just, printer paper is totally fine. Creativity, we get asked about creative resumes a lot, and I think that this completely depends on your field. It depends on the position that you're applying for, and it depends really on what you want to convey. So, if creativity and like graphic design is either your major or something that you'll be responsible for in a position, it could be a beneficial thing to have a creative resume. However, for most of the time, I think it's also good to have kind of a straightforward resume that just lists your experiences so that you can really have that as kind of like a jumping off point for a lot of different positions. And then we always say less is generally more. Typically, the more kind of white space that you have, like the more clearly that it's laid out, the easier it is to read. And oftentimes, employers take about 6 seconds to look at a resume before they decide if they want to continue reading or not. And if you have a very jam packed resume with just lots and lots of words and it looks really daunting for an employer, they might not even continue reading. So, those are all the tips that we have for you all today. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want a one on one appointment with one of our communication consultants at the Writing and Media Center, you can book an appointment on our website. If you Google Writing and Media Center, Iowa State University. Also, if you want an in person, in class presentation, you can request a presentation on our website as well, and one of our consultants will come to your class or extracurricular club and talk about kind of anything that you all want to work on. Um, Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope that you all have a great time working on your resumes.